trickle in here, but this is the CSIS series in Careers and Development, and with me today is Mark Frohardt, who is the Senior Vice President for Strategic Practice at Internews. And I think if you've seen the blurb about Mark, he's worked for NGOs like MSF, he's worked for most of the UN agencies, UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, for Human Rights, and a number of other organizations. He has a lot of experience throughout the world with a variety of different kinds of organizations. And I think it might find interesting, his journey toward this career is rather interesting. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Mark?
All right.
Welcome.
If I can get this to work first. Thank you, Bill. I was speaking to a couple of people outside. First of all, thank you very much for showing up, and I hope this is of interest. I was speaking with a few people outside to try and get some idea of who you are and why you're here. When I asked Bill earlier what kind of people normally you have speaking, I think I'm a little bit of a non-traditionalist, and that'll probably be pretty evident pretty quickly. When I was your age, I probably had nothing in common with you beyond age. But then here we are both in Washington, D.C. now, pretty much trying to do similar work. So in any case, what my path initially started, and I promise this is not going to be a long story about this is my life, but just to give you some sense of where I started, how I got here, so that you can determine whether or not you want to give any credence to what I might say. I dropped out of college, after a couple of years. I wanted to be a teacher. I was very idealistic. It was 1972, and I thought, how in the world can I teach anybody about the world if I haven't seen it and experienced it for myself? And the best way to do that, of course, is to go out and become a drunken sailor and sail around the world. So I dropped out of college, went out to San Francisco, got a job on a ship, and worked on it for about a year and a half and traveled in different places. Then coming back to the United States, the next was to be a photographer. And so I started hanging out with some very avant-garde, crazy photographers in the West and set up a photographic collaborative and gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico in about 1977 or 75. In any case, that failed, but the one great thing that came out of that was I was able to spend a couple of hours in a dark room with Ansel Adams, for anybody who knows anything about classic photography, which was quite a treat. The next thing I decided was to take a trip to do overland, because when I was on the ship, I had never stopped in any one country port for more than 2 or 3, maybe 4 days at the maximum. So I really wanted to spend more time traveling. So I decided to do a overland trip from Bali, Indonesia to the south of France, where I was going to set up another gallery, hopefully successful this time, and travel overland through Asia, Southeast and Central Asia. Well, after about a year and a half on that trip, I'd gotten as far as Tehran, Iran, and I was broke and I needed a job to actually make the money to continue the trip. And for anyone who knows, I arrived in June of 1977, and if anyone knows a little bit about Iranian history, this was a few months before the first demonstrations started that led to the Iranian Revolution. And I stayed there until February 19th of 79, which means about 8 days after the end of the revolution. And I would say that experience really changed me from the wandering, photographing traveler to somebody who was much more aware of how governments and how other institutions can really have an effect and change the way that on the lives of people. And also the complexity for people in Iran at that time to see how people can hold two opposing views at the same time and have a logic for both when sometimes their life really depends on those decisions that they're making. So in any case, after I left Iran, I came back to the United States after about 3 years. years of being away. And when I returned, the big topics in the news were the Iranian Revolution, of course, or the Islamic Revolution, and as well it was also the Khmer Rouge, the exposure of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The Vietnamese had stepped in, had taken over Cambodia and exposed what had been going on in an exceptionally closed society for 4 years in Cambodia. And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Killing Fields, but it was 4 years of real terror in which people were moved out of cities onto work farms, and thousands of, possibly tens of thousands or more, sorry, I can't remember the numbers right now, were killed. And when I was speaking to people in the United States after I returned about the Iranian Revolution, I could see that it was very few people really understood the significance or what it meant for the people of Iran. And I, stopped at a gas station, have somebody refer to Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, a deeply religious leader, as a communist, this type of thing. And so in that context, when I heard about what was going on in Cambodia, I realized that there was something I really could not understand without going there. I needed to really go, I needed to work there, I needed to do some humanitarian work, whatever I could to try and really understand it, because I found it deeply disturbing and really baffling. And so that was when I first started to do the humanitarian work, and I couldn't get into Cambodia, and so I worked on the Thai-Cambodia border in a refugee camp there. And so this is where I will start with my first lesson, or lesson learned, or things that I think is important when we look at the work, this kind of work in particular, international development, or international affairs in general. And that is that proximity is critical. We all know that we need to be good listeners. That is pretty much a given these days. But it's not just about listening. It is the closer you can be to the person whose problems you are trying to address, the better. Whether it be nuance, whether it be context, which is absolutely critical. You cannot really get that without being present, by being in close proximity to the people that you're trying to work with. And a couple of examples are, for example, ethnographers will refer to deep hanging out. And so this is not just about showing up with a clipboard and doing interviews and analyzing and gathering data on individuals. This is being there. It is being present. It is hanging out. It is using the services that they use. Use the cell phone services that they're using, and really trying to understand where they are, because that will allow you not only to more deeply understand the problems that they're dealing with, but it'll also make it much more easy for you to engage them in any solutions, which is increasingly critical. I think that one of the things that I was actually speaking with somebody earlier today about the importance of design thinking and human-centered design. And imagine the age that you are, I would hope that most of you have at least heard of human-centered design and design thinking. And it has become very, very popular, very trendy. But please look beyond that. Please look deeply at this methodology or this approach. It is an approach which was initially developed by designers, and it is one that the best people I've ever worked with in the humanitarian world could be considered impeccable designers, because that is the way they think, that is the way they work. They understand the importance of being close to the populations with which they're working. Just really quickly, I met Bill many years ago, just before going into northern Iraq after the first Gulf War. And we had both worked with a man quite famous among some of us, Fred Cooney, who was a real innovator, was kind of a visionary in the humanitarian world, and really a disruptor as well. And one of the things and we all knew about Fred at the time, was when everybody would hit the ground and would be off talking to the United Nations or at various NGOs and going to coordination meetings and talking to the government, Fred would be out someplace talking to people in the tents. He would be talking to rebel leaders. He would be talking to people who really understood and were experiencing what was going on. And when I went to Rwanda, many years later, I first did the humanitarian work on the Thai-Cambodian border, and then went through working with Médecins Sans Frontières, and then with the High Commissioner for Refugees and the rest. And then Bill one day decided that shortly after the genocide had taken place in Rwanda that he was going to ask me to go off, hired me because he was with Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at the time, to work with the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which is the precursor of the United Nations, UN OCHA now. And so one of this kind of brings me to the second point. I just wanted to reiterate, with regard to being present, you probably at your age will often hear go to the field, and it's true. You should try and go to the field, but you can't all do that. But what is important in the work that you're doing, if you're talking about working with people who are from a foreign country in particular, is if you cannot go to the field, you find opportunities when they come here. Especially in Washington, D.C., there are multiple events in where you can find people who are living those experiences, are coming here, go and listen to them, and then get them afterwards and talk to them and listen to them and try and find and understand as deeply as possible. And use that when you start thinking about how you're going to assist or work with any of those communities. One of the things that I just wanted to also point out is that my second point, if you will, is that it's not about institutions. A lot of people, especially those who come to Washington, D.C., are looking to work at USAID, looking at the State Department, looking to work at the World Bank, and those are all noble endeavors. But I personally am a bit of an iconoclast, and that is not because I don't believe in these institutions. It's because I believe that our approach to these institutions should be that our greatest responsibility is to change them, is to evolve them. Institutions are built on a worldview which is years old, sometimes 10, 30, 40 years old. And the world is changing so rapidly now that a lot of times the work of these institutions is behind the times, and that is a real waste. In 1987, when I went back to finish my undergrad, one of the readings that I did, and this is I think a professor from the University of Florida, and at the time one of the things that he said was, and this is in 1987, so this is way before the mobile revolution, okay? And he said, there are no more traditional societies. All societies now are transitional. The world is the global village was the big term at the time. And now that you have mobile technology, which is going incredibly deep into a lot of these communities, they are connected to the outside world. They can actually see what is going on the other side of the planet if they have a data connection. That is a very different world. And what that means is that it is rapidly changing and it is evolving. And so when you're thinking about the problems that you want to address, when you're thinking about the work that you want to do, think about, first of all, as someone told me many years ago, think about something that keeps you up at night. Think about something that really makes you angry when you think about the consequences of that problem. Because if it doesn't really make you angry, you should be thinking about doing something else. Because it's going to be a long slog, and there will be very few successes along the way, but those that you have are going to be great, especially if you really believe in the things that the problems that you're trying to address. So with regard to, so of course now I lose exactly where I am in this whole talk. I'll just give you a few examples of what I'm talking about with regard to how to evolve various organizations. How are we doing on time? Are we okay?
Don't worry about it.
Okay, all right. So, I'm really not sure if this is the kind of thing that you want to listen, and so I want to hear. And so if you find that I'm really kind of going on about old war stories or something like that, just kind of yawn or something, kind of, give me a little impression of how I'm doing up here. When we're talking about institutional change, one of the first organizations that really excited me was Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And one of the reasons for that was that, and this will kind of touch on the 2 points that I was trying to make, when I was working in that first camp on the Thai-Cambodian border, and this was a camp of 130,000 refugees. This is the largest concentration of Cambodians outside of Phnom Penh. This is the second largest population center in Thailand after Bangkok. And it was all in 3 square kilometers, so it was a pretty crazy affair. And there were over 13 different humanitarian organizations in one block of thatched and bamboo-built hospitals, all providing medical services. 3 different organizations from different countries just providing pediatric care. So it was chaos. And I learned a lot about the various organizations there. And one of the things that really attracted me to the MSF staff was that I would often see them just hanging out with patients. They would be sitting outside, getting a little bit of sun. They would not necessarily be treating them, engaging, finding, hanging IVs. They would just be hanging out with them. And the rapport between them and their patients, I did not see anywhere else. And this is not to say that the other organizations were not doing a great job, because they were, but they were the ones who I really noticed. And so, but on the other hand, we also we needed to have drills for being prepared for, we were 3 kilometers from the border, and so there was always the possibility of an attack, of an incursion from forces coming across the way. And so the idea was that if you were parked there inside these hospital grounds, your car was supposed to be parked, facing out with at least half a tank of gasoline, so that you could actually get somewhere during the evacuation, and that you didn't back over any children on your way out, so facing out. And the one day that we actually did one of these, a quick check, what we found was that MSF was parked in the wrong way. Their keys were locked in the trunk of their car, and when we finally found, got the car open, the car was almost out of gas. And so they really weren't doing very well in the logistics, okay? And so this is 1980. All right. Well, about that time, there was a man by the name of Jacques Pinel, who was a French pharmacist, and he had determined that this had to change. He had unfortunately had a group of doctors and nurses that had gone into Darfur from Khartoum just before rainy season, which meant that because they didn't have good comms, he lost contact with a team for over 8 months. They didn't know if they were alive or dead. They had no idea where they are. They were having a great time. They were working with the Chadian rebels who were hanging out just across the border from Chad and providing an incredible service, but they were completely cut off. And so he determined at that time that that really had to change. And so between 1980 and 91, when the second part of the story, is that they really focused on the independence of the, and really focused on lightweight logistics. And this was a critical point at the time, because most of those organizations that really had the capacity to be able to respond were the ones that had the funds to come in and set up, a pool of 200 cars and, very, very heavy logistics, which were often very slow to come. MSF really focused on lightweight, independent logistics. Flash forward, when about the time that I met Bill, and we were trying to get a group of Kurdish refugees out of the mountains in Turkey back into northern Iraq after the first Gulf War. And I was interviewing people and talking with those in the camps and some of the people who had been providing services, because I needed to get them ready to move back. And this is where I met Mr. Hess, who's in the back as well. He was there with the military at the time, providing humanitarian services. And the first people that I found that had actually been there the longest were the U.S. Special Forces. And as you know, the Special Forces can be dropped in the middle of nowhere and make things work. And I found a few of them, and they were combing the camps, and the camps were separated all over various mountaintops. And so I asked them, I said, well, this is great, you really are tracking things, but how do you guys get around? Because, the camps are so spread out. He said, we just find somebody from MSF. They've always got an all-terrain vehicle. And so here you go, from, the ones that had the keys locked in the back of their car to ones who are providing logistical support to the U.S. Special Forces. That is institutional change. And it wasn't long after that that MSF was actually nominated for and eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize because of their interventions. And next one I wanted to talk about quickly was, and this is when Bill asked me to go into the work in Rwanda, and this is in post-genocide Rwanda. And at the time, so this was 94. I think it was August of 1994, so just after the war had ended. And at the time, and it's probably still a little bit true, but I won't say that, I'll just say it was at the time, UN agencies are like fiefdoms. They all have their independent mandates, and they do not necessarily have to coordinate with each other. And you notice the word coordinate. Because of all things in a humanitarian crisis, imagine that there's no written mention of management, which would really be a beautiful thing, but it's all about coordination. And in Rwanda, they actually got to the point where coordination was a little bit of a strong word, and we should really talk about consensus building, if you can imagine that in the middle of an emergency. So in any case, because they have individual mandates, and because those mandates are to either deliver food or care for refugees or care for children, they have a very clearly laid out plan on how to do that. And the coordination is not necessarily something that they want to do, especially those that are exceptionally well resourced and quite determined to lead. And so the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, much like the Office of the Humanitarian Coordinator, was a new organization and really didn't do anything other than coordinate. And when you're in the middle of an emergency, those people who do not do anything other than organize meetings really don't get a lot of respect often, and they are really they're not listened to, although they can serve an incredible function. And so one of the things that we did at that time, and one of the things that I was trying to push, was the use of new information technologies and for the actual coordination of organizations. So in other words, rather than coming in and approaching it as a mandate, is to say we're responsible for coordination, going in and gathering information from the various organizations, and with the familiarity with new information systems is to enrich that information in a way that people will naturally come to you because you are really helping and assisting in the coordination through information. And that'll eventually, and we got some GIS mapping programs, which really impressed a lot of people at the time. And we were able to actually start to do that. And it wasn't until Kosovo, the next emergency that followed, that actually came into fruition in the creation of what were called the Humanitarian Coordination Centers, the HICs. And the guy that I had trained to do this in Rwanda, and when I saw them in Kosovo, he said, "Hey, Mark, remember all the things that we were trying to do in Rwanda? Well, guess what?" And he took me into an office where he had 5 people, computer specialists, all sitting in front of huge GIS mapping programs. Talk about transformation. So I know that we're probably getting on in time, so I'll just mention, there are just a couple of other quick things. Right now I'm working with an organization called Internews. It was initially a media development organization, and we've pretty much evolved past that. And one of the things that we've done there, again, in evolving, if you will, the organization, is to move from looking at information in the traditional sense of broadcast models. Looking at the audience, because we no longer have a world in which there is an audience and then there are the producers. Everybody is the producer as well as the audience member as well, consumer and producer. And so moving from that model of the broadcast, we created something which was called the information ecosystem. And this led to some research with the Rockefeller Foundation, and it is a model which is increasingly used by others in the international development field, because what it does is it looks at information as it moves through a community. And once it leaves a radio station, then it might not have the impact that you think it's going to have on the community until the local priest actually reinforces that information through the contacts that he or she might have. And so it is really looking at information in a very different sense. Who are the influencers? And so this is my point with regard to when you're looking at where you might want to work, I would really ask that you really think first about yourself. And you think about what motivates you, what are the problems that you want to address, and what are the institutions right now that might actually be primary or as far as doing something with that problem, but how you can also, once you're there, is really change the way that they address those problems, because they all need to evolve. So there are other things that I could say here, but I think that I should probably stop and open it up for questions.
Okay, I'll just start, and if you all can think about what you'd like to ask Mark next, but I would be very interested, if you look at the landscape of the international community now, which do you think are the most progressive in terms of having evolved and in their use of information, for example?
Well, see, this is one of the interesting things about I think one of the main points that we all need to think about when we're thinking about the development world, and this is about the democratization of technology, okay? And a big element of that is the democratization of information technology. Okay, it started first with the fax machine, where the president of Brazil was doing a speech in New York in '93 and was saying, we're no longer cutting the rainforests. And someone in the back of the room stood up and said, I have a fax from a little tiny NGO who's actually living next to the forest that this morning they can count the number of trees that were cut down and burned. That's from a little tiny NGO. This is no longer, about institution to institution. And so that is a very different world. And so one of the things that Internews had to confront was the fact that often with an agricultural or other type of service program is that they might look toward how can we get a radio program on this? Well, guess what? Everybody's got not only a handset, there's an increasing chance that they're also going to have a smartphone. So now all organizations that are working in the field have access to very simple platforms for communicating with the people that they are serving. And I think that there are some organizations that are doing this really well, other organizations that are doing it less well. I don't want to... How could I actually mention? I think that Unicef is one organization I know because we worked with them in Liberia. And we set up there what was called a rumor tracker, in which we had people that would actually send us the various rumors that we would then compile, aggregate, and give to journalists who would then do investigations and then do radio programs on this is a rumor, this is true, that kind of thing. And I know that Unicef was very involved in that. I think Mercy Corps is also a more thoughtful organization. IMC is a very thoughtful organization, but Mercy Corps actually does research on their own. They look deeply into a lot of the work that they do, and they think deeply about it, and they think more progressively about it. But I can't think of any others right off the top of my head. But I think a lot of organizations are looking at how they can communicate better through information technologies.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. Please, we'll have microphones come around. State who you are and your affiliation so Mark knows who he's talking to. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you stand as well? Hi, thank you for that very insightful talk. My name's Alexandra, and I recently completed my master's in human rights from LSE. And I wanted to ask you, one thing I was advised about is that the human rights field and the humanitarian or development world kind of stay separate in the work they do, despite working on similar issues or in similar conflicts. And since you've worked a lot in humanitarian world, but also for the Commissioner on Human Rights, I was wondering your take on that, and if you see that in practice. So thank you.
Different institutions have different approaches, and depending on whether those institutions have an international or a legal mandate. For example, there's a big difference between the International Committee for the Red Cross, which is a Geneva-based organization, which serves, to implement the Geneva Conventions, and that there are states that have signed on to those conventions. That's the reason why they're allowed into the prisons. That's a very different thing. And so now, and also with regard to the High Commissioner for Refugees, if someone's a refugee, they're a stateless person. They do not have a government that can protect their human rights. That means that UNHCR has now been given the authority to protect them. And so I would say that also with human rights, it's a very similar thing. In a lot of cases, the approach, especially from the UN, is one of you are signed on to, so you must abide by. That is a really difficult position to take with somebody who does not want to comply. And it does not immediately set up a really great relationship. When I was working in Rwanda, I initially went with the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, and and this was the first field mission for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was appointed, I think it was either the day before or the day after the genocide took place in Rwanda. Welcome to your new job. He was put at the UN Center for Human Rights, which has a special rapporteurs who only do reports and research, and he was given one person, one staff, I believe, at the time. And so when he mounted a 100-plus mission of people to send to Rwanda and post-genocide Rwanda to start investigating human rights and protecting human rights of people there, it was a total mess. And it was a mess because they had no logistical support. It was like asking the Library of Congress to put out an oil fire. They really understood the principles of it, but they had no idea. They had no procurement. They had no way of no logistics. They had no way of actually operationalizing that. And so very quickly, that meant that the perceptions of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights mission in Rwanda was poorly perceived. I worked with a lot of Rwandans, and I knew how poorly perceived they were. There was animosity at levels I had seldom seen for an institution, because the Rwandans thought they were going to come in and show that the genocide had taken place. Okay? No, they came in and started reporting on the military for abusing the rights currently. Well, this military were the ones that actually had stopped the genocide. So really, you're going to focus on them beating somebody up right now when they just stopped a genocide? So the misunderstanding between them was profound. And so for myself, the way that I looked at it was that in that country, in that geographic space, if you will, there were two entities that were responsible for protecting the rights of the Rwandans. One was the Rwandan government, number one. And number two is, because of a special mandate, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so why aren't they working together? Quite simply. And so one of the things that I did was that I got the military, three top commanders from the military and the three top leaders of the UN Human Rights, locked in a room in a hotel for 3 days so that they would actually talk to each other and figure out how they were going to work with each other. And they did. I can tell you that first day was really frosty because they hated each other. Well, one hated, the other one had very little respect for. But they did start to work together. And it was because of that that I was actually asked to come back and start working with the UN Commission for Human Rights, and it really changed the operations. And so another thing, one of the things that we did, and these are exemplary of the thinking behind what you need to change and why there is a problem with human rights in some ways as an approach, is that we had human rights monitors all over the country. Okay. Well, in African society, somebody that monitors, especially at the village level, someone who monitors, really, you're going to come in and watch us? Where you're talking about a community that is based on participation, is based on, engagement, being part of and contributing to, and then someone's going to sit there as an observer. So one of the first things that I did was I changed the names, and they were no longer human rights monitors, they were human rights field officers. And so when they went in, they actually found ways of engaging that population. And there were other things that they did. It wasn't just to monitor, so as to focus on that. And so I would say that wherever possible, it is great to be able to avoid an approach that is you should. And if it is that, it has to be in communication with. One of the other things that we did was to stop reporting on this, doing reports, sending them to Geneva, and having them broadcast internationally, and that's how the Rwandan government found out about it. We would take a report, we would go to the Rwandan government, we would lock ourselves in a room, sometimes for 3 hours, sometimes shouting at each other. I mean, I was really surprised. Rwandans can be very cool, but I was really surprised when we started actually working together on various charges, right? And we came out of those meetings with real progress, to the point where they actually assigned a second military prosecutor to start looking into cases that we had brought against the military. And so things can change. And also, we would write that report, we would send it to their draft to them, we would ask them their input, and then when we published the final report, it was like, this is what we say. Sometimes we corrected what we said based on information from the military, and this is what the Rwandan military says. And I can tell you our relation changed overnight. And so this again comes back to the, I didn't even know what human-centered design was at the time, but this comes back to the thing is you have to be engaged with. It has to be a dance. And you might step on each other's feet, and it might be clumsy at various times, but the worst thing you can do is to both step off of the dance floor. Because as long as you're dancing, whether or not it's the most beautiful thing, you're at least engaged. You're at least going somewhere. So I don't know. Sorry, that's a very long answer to a very brief question.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm finishing my doctorate in civil engineering from the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I'm curious, sort of following on some of the things you said in your last answer and thinking about sort of just other people in development I've heard speak. What is your perspective, based off your experiences, of the benefits or the relationship between big development, for example, the World Bank model, compared with the grassroots level? And so how you see the interplay. Because I know there are some people who really believe in, if it's going to impact only one person, it's not worth it, versus people who think, no, every person counts. I'm curious in your perspective of the relationship between those two different models.
Right. I think you already have the answer. What's your name again? I'm sorry. Sarah? We were talking with Sarah earlier, and she was is going into engineering, and was talking about in engineering whether or not it is actually building the things that a community might use, or more working with that community and communicating with them and the policymakers and others about that project and about the use of that technology. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing you here. And I think it's the same thing with regard to the question you're asking right now. It's not one end of the spectrum or the other. And they are both really important. But the thing which is most important is if they're communicating with each other. Okay? Because the more that people who are working at the grassroots level can be communicating with and coming to consensus with the people who are working at the larger level, the better. Often, when we've been working in various situations and we're really close to a community, we'll see people are trying to look at the opportunities for collecting crime collecting crime, particularly in villages on two sides of a border. Okay, so what are they doing? Well, they're actually looking at the possibility of going to the National Statistics Board and gathering government statistics, which are in most cases 5 to 10 years old. All right, and seeing how those might be compiled, and then this government talking to this government about something that's happening down here. Well, what if at the same that is important at one level, but what if at the same time you go down to those communities who are actually closer to each other, because that border is really kind of arbitrary, and you actually put together an app that they can start using to gathering data on crime that they're seeing firsthand. And that's another thing. And it might be really valuable on its own, but it's even greater value if it's connected to what the government is doing. And so I think that both are important, and both can be very flawed if they only focus on that one. So the more they can communicate, the more you can look for opportunities. And so, like, for example, if you're working on a small community project and the last person you have any interest in going to see is somebody from the World Bank, go see somebody from the World Bank. Talk to them about what you're doing. Find out what they're doing and get their opinion of things and their view of things, and then start connecting to them. I really find it, I think it's critical. Sorry.
Hi. My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector and capital markets advisor, and your comments are really wonderful, but far too late for me.
Well, it took me about 55 years to get here, or longer, but anyway, please.
Yeah, I understand. You didn't talk much about how you sustained yourself early on when you were cycling to each of these passionate spots of interest. What kind of jobs did you have, and did you come from a privileged background? And the second thing is, all that time, weren't you concerned that you might end up just spinning your tires all those years while your friends were back home in graduate school and starting on career paths, so that by the time you got this out of your system and came home, you were way behind the curve, and as they had already begun to emerge as subject matter experts in areas that you really had no expertise?
I think the short answer is I was having too much fun to think about that. I was really, I was a military brat. So I was born in Japan, and I never stayed in any place for more than 18 months until I was 12. And I spent 12 to 22 in Colorado. And so I would just say that a lot of the early jobs that I had were construction jobs. Some of the best habits I learned, and I'm sure you probably heard this from your grandfather and many other old people, is back when I was doing carpentry. Is a lot of it, some of the best habits, working habits and all the rest that I ever learned were on those construction jobs. How to get a job. Actually, how to get a job which has served me in almost every environment, no matter where I've been since. I was learned on a construction site. And so I would just say that at the time, I worked on the ship. I worked wherever I could. I got labor jobs, whatever it was that I needed, to take me on to the next thing. But the thing was, I really do think, and this is the reason why I actually mentioned it, is because that is exactly the kind of thinking that I tried to bring into the work that the reason why I'm here now is because there are things about the world that really upset me. And I think there are ways of approaching it that a lot of people aren't looking at. And so that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think a lot of that goes back to sitting there in the Iranian Revolution and seeing people, and I'll say this without trying to say this without getting teary-eyed, but seeing people subjected to what they were subjected to during the Shah of Iran, the paranoia, the depth of the paranoia that I felt, and all would have happened to me if I had said the Shah's name publicly was I would have been thrown out of the country. But I mean, for Iranians, it was a very different thing. And to see what they went through during that revolution, I think really changed my view. You're already there. You're already thinking about doing international development. So you, fortunately, don't have to look through a revolution to go through. But I think that it really comes back to, and this is the reason why I said earlier, it's not about the institutions, it is about who you are as individuals, because a lot of these institutions will come and go. And you will serve them best. You will serve yourself best by really following what you want to do and figuring out how you can use these institutions and others as vehicles. I'm sorry, I don't know if that answers your question.
Most of the people in this room are women. And it raises different issues. They're not going to become construction workers, I wouldn't think. And there are personal issues of personal safety that probably relate in a different way between a man and a woman. What guidance can you give on how you can find these entry-level jobs and still maintain some sense of personal safety?
Yeah, I think that the world is a very different place than when I traveled through northern Pakistan. I went the northern route. I took a month to travel the northern route through Afghanistan before the war. There's no way I could have done any of those things now. And so the world has changed. It has changed significantly. And unfortunately, some people are more, I wouldn't say vulnerable, but I would say some people are targeted more easily. And for that, I would say the number one thing is situational awareness. The most important element of security, it's not whether you're driving in a bulletproof car, it's that you have situational awareness and you know where to go and when to go. And so whether you're male or female, you need to know it if you're going to be traveling overseas. And I would say that, nowadays that I think that women have opportunities that they never had before. And my wife will blanch here, but I have daughters, and so I'm probably a little bit sexist here. And I think that they do bring a view of the world and an approach which is much needed and quite unique, if you will.
Oh, let's go over here first, and then here.
When I said sexist, I meant biased toward women. Sorry about that. When you have daughters, that's what happens,
Hello, my name is Michelle. I have a background in private sector corporate world, but currently I'm working at a humanitarian nonprofit. So I completely agree with you that the world is absolutely changing at a very quick pace, and I would say a large part of that does have to do with technology and social media in particular. So I wanted to ask you what your perspective is on how social media and companies like Facebook and Google have transformed the way that you need to do your work in creating media models, and do you think that those types of companies need to have a sense of ownership or responsibility and role within that as well?
Yes, to all the above. Yes, I think that, one of the things that often happens is that when we're thinking about how we intervene, several years ago, somebody came up, what was her name? Mary, no, it wasn't Lang, Mary, who was in Boston, who came up with this concept of do no harm. Do no harm is originally... Mary Anderson, thank you. It's originally what all the, Hippocratic oaths and what doctors think about in the very first place, but she really made a big deal about this idea of do no harm. And the reason why is because even when you're trying to help, you can do incredible harm. Okay, and that's not even if you're just trying to run a great business and make a great profit, which you think is actually serving people. But even those who are really intending to serve a community can actually really provide, it can really actually cause harm. I do think that right now, one of the reasons why I joined Internews when I did, this was, 15 years ago now. It's the longest I've ever worked with any organization. But the reason why was because for me, this is the information age, We had, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. This is the information revolution. Information is changing our world. It is the most, in my mind, it is the most influential currency or form of energy that is possibly actually changing the way that things are moving forward. Just look what's happening in the United States right now. And so I really do believe that anyone who is involved in creating new platforms, anyone who is involved in being a conduit in any way, really needs to think deeply about what are the consequences of that information. And it is complex. It is not easy. The reason why Facebook and others are not possibly doing more about it is because it is not easy to figure out. Okay, and I do think that one of the things that we really need to think about, and I would say, is that it is less about production than it is about consumption. There's a term, media, I hate to say this, but media literacy, because media literacy is, many years ago had a very bad reputation. But the idea of being able to be a critical thinker and to be able to really understand what is the information that you're getting and how that needs to, and how to discern, what is right from wrong. And so I think that the majority of the work that really needs to be done is not necessarily on the production side. Yes, it would be great if Facebook could pay more attention to it. It would be great if a lot of the people who provide those platforms could. But again, then you're talking about possible censorship, or you're talking about someone else making those decisions. And so for me, the more that we can focus on literacy, the more that we can focus on the consumption side so that people become critical consumers, I think that's where we really need to focus now.
Thank you. Hi, my name is also Sarah. A little bit about my background. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, finished my master's in international development, and am currently working at the U.S. Treasury in the International Affairs Department. So when I started my career in development, I was also very idealistic and hung out in Africa for 2 years.
Yes,
and
you did. If you were with the Peace Corps, you definitely did.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you about the frustrations that you faced in some of these, whether it be grassroots or higher level positions, and how you managed them. So from a grassroots level, if your project falls down, or even getting someone to care about the same passions that you do, versus on a higher level, even having governments not acknowledge that there is a problem. How do you manage the frustrations that you feel personally to further your career and evolve these programs that you're working with? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a little more complex than I usually like for a question to be, but I'll see what I can do with it. I think that that's the reason earlier that I said that you really need to find something that makes you angry. And that's the reason why I said that you're going to have very few successes. Because a lot can be done in this world, but there are the challenges, whether it be climate change, whether it be the global economy, whether it be the form that conflict takes right now, being much more informal, if you will, than it used to be. I think that all of these things make the work that you're thinking about doing much more complex, much more challenging. And so what I would say is you just have to know that you have to believe that you're working on something that really you care about, and where you think that you can make a difference. And you constantly need, you constantly need to be looking for what are the solutions. You have to be undyingly analytical. Okay, I mean, when I was working in Rwanda, I was the head of the deputy chief of the UN Human Rights mission there, and we had 8 or 12 different teams around the country. And so people would often come from those various teams, and they would tell me about a problem that they had, whether it would be with the mayor or whether it be with the local jail or something along these lines. And some of these were really complex, and they were important because they had to do with people's lives often. And so I got to the point where I actually had to say to them, do not bring me a problem without 3 solutions. Okay, and the reason was because I needed them to start thinking on their own about what the solutions were. Because and it wasn't that they didn't on their own, but they were exhausted. They were up against it. They had tried many things, but just the fact that on that 2-hour drive into Kigali, they knew that when they walked into my office, I would say, "What are your 3 potential solutions?" It got them thinking in that space. And so I would say it's the same thing when you're talking about what keeps you going, and what is, and it's perseverance, it's passion, it's belief that you can make a difference, and it's a constant analysis of the problems that you're dealing with, and then a determination of maybe I should be doing something different, maybe I should try a different approach, maybe I should be working with a different organization. Because if you don't beat your head against the same wall unless you see some movement on that wall, okay? And I would just say that, this is as an aside, is that with regard to the people that you work with, a lot of you are younger, and the first jobs that you have right now are going to be very formative. They're going to determine how you might work with people in the future. And so when you take a job, when you're looking at some place to work, don't think of it just as a job. Think of it as a community, okay? Inquire, find out whether the supervisor who might be supervising really wants to see your ideas, wants to hear from you, wants you to figure problems out, wants you to be involved. Maybe, you're a junior person, but they should still want your participation and involvement. And so if you're working someplace where people do not care about you, what you think, and you don't feel like you're having an impact, then you really need to think about finding some place that will really start to help you grow, because you can only do it for so long, and then you give up. And the last thing I would just say there is that when this is something from a slightly different approach, but it's called, in Sarajevo, it was called the seduction of normalcy. And so in other words, you go into a situation, and the security situation isn't that bad, and so you're there for, and then all of a sudden they start laying landmines, and all of a sudden there are certain attacks on civilians, and then there are, various other security degradations that start to happen, and you justify all along the way, I'm not going to travel on those roads. I'm going to make sure I'm living in this part of town. And so after a while, you get to a point where if the security situation had been that way before you arrived or before you considered going, you would have never gone. But you're kind of seduced into, I'll make this work. I have a better understanding of it, and I'll make this work. And so it's the same thing in a job. You think, after a while, I would never sit in a job for 5, 10 years without any progress at all. Well, I mean, like if you've been in that job if a person has been in that job for a year and there's no progress at all, think again. That's my personal opinion. And that's how you'll really reinvigorate yourself, is to know that you are doing something about it. You are taking action based on the analysis that you're doing. And the last thing I just wanted to say there, because you brought up a really good example, and that is, it is very easy to go through life unconscious. It is very easy to go through life having a plan, thinking that plan is all that you need. And that is often informed about beliefs that you have that you're not even conscious of. And the more that you do that, and there was a quote that I heard the other day, is that if you're not conscious, if you don't make your unconscious beliefs conscious, they will determine your life and you will call it fate. Okay? And I think that, this is something that, when I look at, for example, in Goma, after the Rwandan genocide, there were a lot of people who were involved in the genocide, the families, the génocidaires, the people who committed it, and their families in the military. They were driven out in two directions, one going into Goma and Zaire at the time, and the other into Tanzania. And Goma became a series of camps that I think it was over 1 million people. And there was génocidaires that were running those camps. There was no question about it. And it was a real sham, or I should say, sorry, it was a real shame that the international humanitarian community continued to provide support to those camps without doing something about it. There are 3 organizations that I knew and I talked to later, because I did a little bit of a study on it. And those 3 organizations were very similar to each other, so I won't mention their names, and they had a lot of commonalities. But the first one determined that they were not going to work there because there was no way that they were going to work in a camp that was really run by the génocidaires. Okay? The second one determined that, well, this is a humanitarian crisis. It's not up to us to decide who determines or who's running these camps. We're going to be here as long as this population is here. The third one said, we are going to do whatever we can to change the situation. We're going to determine what those goals are. And they determined, one, it was going to be, they were going to do everything possible to end payment of the workers in the camps in American dollars. Because imagine all the workers, the sweepers, the day cleaners, the home visitors and everybody, they were being paid in cash. They were being paid in U.S. currency. Do you think that they held on to that currency after they were paid when the camp was run by génocidaires? Absolutely not. And the génocidaires were making a lot of money they could use on the black market to purchase arms because it was dollars. Okay? And so they basically campaigned, and it took months, but they actually got it changed. So the policy was that they were all paid in a local currency, which means that the people who were running that camp could no longer purchase the arms that they had been able to before. The other thing that they were able to do is to say that there was so much distortion of the food distribution in this camp, and the census numbers were like off the charts. And all of that extra food, again, was going to the génocidaires who were selling it on the market, who were then using it for arms and other types of political pressure on the community. And so what they basically did is they took, because they had home visitors, they took all of the population figures they had, because they had people going into all of the homes on a regular basis, handed over to the UN and said, here's the real distribution numbers if you want to. And that eliminated tons of food that was going to the génocidaires. And once they did that, they left, okay? And they were gone. They had to leave after that. All right. So my point here being is that it's very easy for us to say, well, I kind of have to do this, or I should do this for a while, or maybe eventually I will get, make some progress. Or you can determine, these are the things that I want to do in life. These are the things I want to do with this job, and I'm going to be able to do them within this time period. And if I can't, I'm going to move on.
Anybody have one last? Okay.
Can I go? Okay. Hi, my name is Ruth, and I am a Peace Corps intern, not a volunteer. But I was just wondering, you've mentioned a lot of different ways that you've solved a situation or crisis or problem creatively, and I was just wondering, for people who want to be where you are, what advice would you give us for the process of thinking creatively to solve thinking creatively to solve problems, and then also like what is your process of stepping back from a problem so that you can have a clear mindset of how to go about a certain situation?
The first thing I would say is meditate daily, and I mean daily. Okay, and I'm not just the one who has said that, but there are a significant number of studies out there about mindfulness meditation that really points to the ability for that to help you sit back, take note, to be more present, to be more aware of where you are, and that really helps in clearly seeing the problems that you're addressing. Okay, so it might sound strange, and yes it is, but I can tell you that there are significant numbers of CEOs out there. I was at a thing in California a couple of years ago, and Google and everybody else were starting their, because of the research, of course, but they were starting meetings with meditation and stuff like that, which is a little bit more than people could handle, I think. But that was also the year that, you know, that a lot of CEOs and very successful people at the very tops of management were talking about, yeah, I've been meditating for 30 years. Yeah, I've been meditating for 20 years. And so you're young enough to start these habits. And I would say that as an individual, and this might really sound weird, and this might sound schmaltzy or whatever else, but you need to think of yourselves as a warrior. You need to think of who you are as an individual and how you're going to prepare yourself for your life and how you're going to contribute, because it goes way beyond the job that you have. And the only way that you're really going to realize this job is that if you are the best that you can be. A friend of mine who was, you know, an executive in a small NGO many years ago, actually a small NGO, and he had read a management book, and he came to me one day and said, Mark, I've read that, you know, if you spend more than 5% of your day on your personal logistics, you're lost. Well, I think that was probably a bit of an exaggeration, but he's right. Okay? Think about your daily life. Think about how you spend your time. There are so many things that you have to do to live, to go to the dry cleaning, go shopping, you know, and these things can eat up your time. They can eat up your life. So put together a system. Organize yourself in a way that becomes a minor thing. It's something you take care of, and then spend that extra time meditating, going out and going for a walk, doing whatever. But I think that really the more that you can clear your mind by taking care of the clutter in your life, and you're young enough to start having these habits and creating these habits now, the more the time that you can spend on thinking about the problems where you really want to be creative, where you want to be relaxed, where you aren't feeling hurried because you have to get out to do, you know, the dry cleaning or whatever. So I'd say that it's really about managing your life and sitting at least once a day. You know.
Final question over here.
Hi, Michael Jorgensen, also a recent graduate in economics from the London School of Economics. I had previously lived abroad 7 years in Turkey, Qatar, not quite low-income countries, but today we've had a large focus on the outside world, development organizations, constantly changing technologies. And I wanted to ask more about the United States and what changes we need to have in the United States in order to better respond to development necessities in the world. Thank you.
Is anybody, I don't know how many of you here, you know, it's because you recently come out of school, studied de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was a French philosopher, but he came to the United States, and what was the name of his book, In America or On America or something like that? Sorry? Democracy in America, thank you. But anyway, one of the things that really impressed de Tocqueville when he came to the United States, I don't know, 100 years ago or more, was town hall democracy. Is that he saw that in the United States that there was community organization around people coming together and solving their own problems within their own communities. That they didn't depend on, you know, the government coming in to, you know, to clean things up. So I mean, of course, there are a lot of people who have jumped on that from the other, you know, from maybe different perspective. But my point here is that we, I think, in this country, have really allowed ourselves to be consumed with entertainment and with an easy life. You know, leisure has become exceptionally important. And so I'm not asking you to go out there and live the hard life or, you know, scrub floors on a regular basis or whatever. But I am trying to say is that awareness of your community and your role in that community and you finding the time in your day or your week to actually go out and do something for your community is a beautiful thing. It's an incredible thing. And there, right now in the United States, I've heard that there are some efforts to do community organization like never before. And so for me, I think that one of the most important things for this country right now, if you're talking about what we can do in our own community, is communicating with people that you don't want to communicate with. You know? I mean, there are so many silos. You're talking about information. I mean, information is actually made it easier for us to not talk to our neighbor, but to have a community across the planet. And so I think that the more that we're always going to have different opinions. But we're not going to solve anything unless we can actually communicate with those people who disagree with us. Sorry.
I'm also concerned about our perception of the world as Americans as well. Do you feel that needs?
This is why John F. Kennedy started the Peace Corps. I mean, a lot of people think that it's go out and do some development and help a community. The main reason was so that young Americans could go out and actually see what was going on in the rest of the world and then bring that back and share that with people within their community. We're in a challenging time right now. And so I think that it's up to us, it's up to those who have relationships with different countries or different cultures to be able to share that information and pay attention to your language, please. This is not a battle. This is not, you better pay attention to this because this culture is important. No. You know, this is about actually sharing it in a way so somebody who normally has a very different or opposed opinion to it actually finds it somewhat interesting. You know, there's this a guy recently, African-American guy, and I can't remember now, a bad memory, age coming here. And I think it's Alabama or someplace, that he's actually been reaching out to people in the KKK. And he's just been going out to have lunch with them. You know, and it's just like they walk out and they go, that guy isn't so bad after all, you know. I mean, this is really astounding stuff. And it's not going to work in all situations, but I do think that that is really one of the most critical things that we can do is to bring ourselves back together.
Great. Thanks. Please join me in thanking Mark for being here.